In North Dakota's oil boom country, where industrial progress meets ancient prairie, some mysteries pulse beneath the earth itself. At 11:47 p.m. on October 22, 2023, Federal Pipeline Inspector James Redwing pulled his government-issued Ford F-150 onto a gravel access road 15 miles northwest of Watford City, North Dakota. The truck's headlights cut through the prairie darkness, illuminating the skeletal silhouettes of oil derricks against the star-filled sky. Redwing had been conducting environmental compliance surveys in McKenzie County's oil fields for 3 years, but tonight's inspection was different. Unscheduled, unauthorized, and driven by methane readings that didn't match any geological models he knew. Redwing stepped out into the October cold, his breath forming clouds in the 20-degree air. The portable gas detection equipment in his truck had been registering anomalous readings for weeks, methane concentrations that seemed to pulse in regular intervals, as if the earth itself was breathing. According to his supervisor at the Environmental Protection Agency's regional office, such readings were impossible. Methane doesn't behave that way. Ground seepage is steady, predictable, measurable. But James Redwing trusted his instruments more than he trusted bureaucratic explanations. At 2:15 a.m., Redwing radioed his supervisor, Mark Anderson, from the edge of what locals called the Broken Butte Formation, a series of exposed sandstone ridges that had been the site of several abandoned well attempts in the early 2000s. His voice, captured on EPA communication logs, was calm but puzzled. He reported methane concentrations of 847 parts per million near the old well sites, readings that were not only dangerous, but scientifically inexplicable given the geological survey data. "Mark, I'm getting numbers that don't make sense." Redwing's voice crackled over the radio. "The detector's showing concentrations that are off the charts, but they're fluctuating in a pattern. It's like there's a rhythm to it." Anderson's response, according to the official transcript, was immediate. "James, get out of there. Those readings could indicate an imminent blowout. Return to your vehicle and establish a safe perimeter." "I tell you, man, sir." But at 2:47 a.m., during a scheduled check-in, James Redwing didn't answer his radio. The search began at dawn. McKenzie County Sheriff's Deputy Mike Larson arrived at the GPS coordinates provided by the EPA to find Redwing's truck still running, driver's door hanging open, amber warning lights flashing in the pale morning light. His gas detection equipment lay scattered in the gravel beside the vehicle, some pieces damaged, others simply abandoned. The portable radio was found 30 yards away, its battery dead. What troubled investigators most wasn't what they found, but what they didn't find. No signs of a struggle. No blood. No footprints leading away from the scene. James Redwing, a 43-year-old environmental inspector who had spent his career documenting the invisible dangers of industrial America, had simply vanished into the North Dakota night. The only clue to his disappearance was the final reading on his gas detector's memory card, methane levels that peaked at 1247 parts per million. In the industrial safety manual that Redwing carried in his truck, concentrations above 1,000 parts per million are classified as immediately dangerous to life and health. But according to every geological survey of the area, such readings were impossible. The abandoned wells had been properly sealed. The nearest active pipeline was more than 2 miles away. There was no source for such massive methane release. Unless, as some would later theorize, the source wasn't industrial at all. To understand James Redwing's disappearance, you have to understand the transformation of McKenzie County, North Dakota, over the past 15 years. Until 2008, this corner of the state was cattle country, rolling badlands where fourth-generation ranchers raised Angus and Hereford on land their great-grandfathers had homesteaded. The population of the entire county hovered around 5,000 people, most of them clustered in Watford City, a town that consisted of a main street, a grain elevator, and not much else. Then came the Bakken oil boom. By 2012, McKenzie County was producing more oil than some small nations. Hydraulic fracturing technology had unlocked billions of barrels from the Bakken Shale Formation, and seemingly overnight, the quiet ranching community was transformed into an industrial boomtown. The population exploded to nearly 15,000. Housing developments sprouted across the prairie. Truck traffic increased by 4,000% on roads that had been built for farm equipment and school buses. James Redwing arrived in this transformed landscape in 2021, tasked with ensuring that the rapid industrial development complied with federal environmental regulations. It was a delicate position that required him to navigate between the old North Dakota and the new, between ranching families who had worked the land for generations and oil companies that had invested billions in extracting what lay beneath it. Redwing understood both worlds intimately. His mother, Margaret Redwing, was Mandan, born on the Fort Berthold Reservation 40 miles south of Watford City. His father had been a petroleum engineer who worked for Texaco in the 1970s and 1980s, before the technology existed to make back-end extraction profitable. James grew up hearing stories of both the sacred relationship between the Mandan people and the land, and the technical complexities of oil extraction. This background made him uniquely suited for his role as an environmental compliance inspector, but it also made him uniquely aware of the tensions that simmered beneath the surface of McKenzie County's economic prosperity. The ranching families, names like Anderson, Hagen, and Pedersen, that had been on mailboxes since the 1890s, watched their property values skyrocket, even as their way of life was disrupted by industrial traffic, noise, and the constant presence of oil company personnel. Many leased mineral rights to the oil companies, creating generational wealth, but also generational conflict about the environmental costs. The oil workers, meanwhile, were largely transient, men from Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma who lived in man camps and trailer parks, working 2-week shifts before returning home to families hundreds of miles away. They brought money to local businesses, but also strain to local services, schools, and law enforcement. Sheriff Tom Becken found his department responding to bar fights between roughnecks and ranchers' sons, domestic disputes in overcrowded housing, and a dramatic increase in drug-related arrests. The McKenzie County Sheriff's Office, which had operated with 4 deputies in 2008, employed 23 by 2023. Into this complex social and economic landscape came federal oversight. Inspectors like James Redwing represented Washington, D.C.'s authority over an industry that had made McKenzie County the wealthiest per capita in North Dakota. Every pipeline had to be inspected. Every well site had to be monitored. Every environmental impact had to be documented and reported. The oil companies, for their part, invested heavily in community relations. They sponsored high school football teams, donated to local churches, and employed local residents whenever possible. But they also brought teams of lawyers, lobbyists, and public relations specialists to manage their relationship with both federal regulators and local communities. James Redwing's job was to stand in the middle of all these competing interests and ensure that the environmental laws were followed. According to his colleagues at the EPA, he took this responsibility seriously. Too seriously, some would later suggest. In the months before his disappearance, Redwing had been documenting irregularities in the environmental monitoring data submitted by several oil companies operating in McKenzie County. His reports, filed with the EPA's regional office in Denver, noted discrepancies between company-reported methane emissions and his own field measurements. The differences weren't dramatic, but they were consistent and unexplained. James was meticulous. His supervisor, Mark Anderson, would later tell investigators. He believed that environmental protection was a sacred trust. He didn't cut corners, and he didn't accept explanations that didn't match the data. That dedication to accuracy and environmental protection would soon put James Redwing on a collision course with powerful interests in McKenzie County. But on the night of October 22, 2023, he was still just a federal inspector doing his job, armed with nothing more dangerous than a gas detector and an unshakable belief that the data was trying to tell him something important. Something that someone, or something, didn't want him to discover. The investigation into James Redwing's disappearance began with a simple question. What was a federal environmental inspector doing at an abandoned well site in the middle of the night without authorization from his supervisors? According to EPA protocols, all field inspections must be scheduled in advance and coordinated with relevant oil companies. Inspectors are required to notify facility operators at least 48 hours before any site visit, both for safety reasons and to ensure that company representatives are available to accompany federal personnel during the inspection process. James Redwing had followed none of these protocols on October 22, 2023. Deputy Sheriff Mike Larson interviewed Redwing's supervisor, Mark Anderson, on the morning of October 23rd. Anderson was categorical. Redwing had not been authorized to conduct any inspections that weekend. His official schedule showed him off duty until the following Monday. James was supposed to be home with his family, Anderson told investigators. He'd been working a lot of overtime lately, documenting some irregularities in the environmental monitoring data. I told him to take the weekend off. But phone records painted a different picture. At 3:17 p.m. on October 22nd, Redwing had received a 15-minute phone call from a number registered to TransCanada Pipeline Services. The company, however, had no record of any employee calling Redwing that day. When investigators contacted TransCanada's Mackenzie County Operations Manager, David Chen, his response was immediate and emphatic. "We don't call federal inspectors. They call us. And we certainly don't schedule inspections without going through proper EPA channels." Chen's statement was backed up by company phone logs, which showed no outgoing calls to Redwing's number on October 22nd that night. The mystery deepened when phone company records confirmed that the call had indeed originated from a TransCanada number, lasted exactly 15 minutes, and had been placed during normal business hours when the company's office was fully staffed. Someone had used TransCanada's phone system to contact James Redwing, but according to the company, that someone wasn't a TransCanada employee. The GPS data from Redwing's government vehicle provided another troubling piece of the puzzle. His truck had been equipped with a federal fleet tracking system that recorded its location every 30 minutes. The data showed that Redwing had driven directly from his home in Williston to the Broken Butte area, arriving at approximately 11:45 p.m. But the GPS track revealed something else. Redwing had made 2 previous trips to the same general area in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. On October 8th and October 15th, his vehicle had spent several hours in the vicinity of the abandoned well sites during times when he was officially off duty. When investigators cross-referenced these dates with Redwing's work schedule, they discovered that he had taken personal leave on both occasions. His supervisor had approved the time off without question, assuming Redwing was spending time with his family or pursuing personal interests. Instead, he had been conducting unauthorized environmental surveys in some of the most remote areas of Mackenzie County. The most significant break in the timeline investigation came when Deputy Larson interviewed the security manager for Apex Energy Solutions, whose facilities were located 3 miles from the Broken Butte site. The company operated a network of security cameras to monitor their pipeline infrastructure and well sites. According to security manager Tom Bradley, the camera system had experienced what he called technical difficulties on the night of October 22nd. All 6 cameras in Sector 7 went offline at 11:43 p.m., Bradley told investigators. The system logged it as a power failure, but our backup generators were functioning normally. When the cameras came back online at 3:52 a.m., there was no explanation for the outage. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Redwing had arrived in the area at 11:45 p.m., just 2 minutes after the security cameras went dark. The cameras had resumed functioning 10 minutes after his last radio contact. When investigators requested camera footage from other oil company facilities in the area, they discovered a pattern. Every security system within a 5-mile radius of the Broken Butte site had experienced technical problems during the crucial hours of October 22nd and 23rd. Either Mackenzie County had experienced the most unlikely series of equipment failures in its history, or someone with significant technical resources had deliberately blinded the surveillance network. The investigation took another disturbing turn when forensic analysts examined Redwing's gas detection equipment. The devices had been scattered around his truck, some damaged beyond repair. But the memory cards had survived, and they contained readings that EPA scientists initially dismissed as equipment malfunction. Between 2:30 a.m. and 2:43 a.m. on October 23rd, Redwing's instruments had recorded methane concentrations that fluctuated in a regular pattern, rising and falling every 47 seconds like a massive underground heartbeat. The pattern was so precise that it looked artificial, as if someone had programmed the readings. But when EPA technicians tested the equipment in laboratory conditions, they found no evidence of tampering or malfunction. The instruments had been functioning normally. They had recorded exactly what they were designed to record. The question that haunted investigators was simple. If the equipment was working properly, What had caused methane concentrations to pulse with clockwork regularity in an area where no significant methane source existed? As the investigation entered its second week, Deputy Larson found himself dealing with more questions than answers. James Redwing had been conducting unauthorized environmental surveys. He had received mysterious phone calls from oil company numbers. Security cameras had failed throughout the area during the exact time window of his disappearance, and his scientific instruments had recorded readings that seemed to violate the laws of geology. Somewhere in McKenzie County's oil fields, a federal inspector had encountered something that had made him vanish without a trace. But whether that something was criminal conspiracy, environmental catastrophe, or something else entirely, remained a mystery that was growing more complex by the day. 3 days after James Redwing's disappearance, Deputy Sheriff Mike Larson received an unexpected phone call that would reshape the entire investigation. The caller was Sarah Crow Dog, environmental officer for the Mandan Hidatsa and Arikara Nation, whose tribal lands bordered McKenzie County to the south. "I need to talk to you about James Redwing," Crow Dog said. "But not on the phone and not at the sheriff's office. What happened to him isn't random, and it's not the first time." Larson agreed to meet Crow Dog at the Little Missouri State Park, 20 miles south of Watford City. What he learned during that conversation would reveal that James Redwing's disappearance was connected to a pattern of environmental problems that had been developing for months, hidden from public view by a complex web of jurisdictional boundaries and corporate confidentiality agreements. Sarah Crow Dog had been monitoring groundwater quality on tribal land since 2018. Her work, funded by an EPA environmental justice grant, had documented increasing levels of methane, benzene, and other petroleum byproducts in wells that served tribal communities. The contamination wasn't dramatic enough to trigger federal emergency protocols, but it was consistent and worsening. "We've been seeing changes in our water for 2 years," Crow Dog explained. "Not just chemical contamination, but temperature variations. Some of our monitoring wells are showing water temperatures that fluctuate by 15 degrees over the course of a few hours. That doesn't happen naturally." Crow Dog's environmental data painted a disturbing picture. Across a 20-mile area that encompassed both tribal lands and McKenzie County, groundwater monitoring stations had been recording anomalous readings since early 2022. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. Petroleum-related contamination was spreading through underground water systems in ways that didn't match any known geological models. More troubling, the contamination seemed to be concentrated along specific underground pathways that corresponded exactly with the routes of buried pipelines. "James contacted me in September," Crow Dog told investigators. "He'd been analyzing EPA data and noticed that our tribal monitoring results matched irregularities he was seeing in his own surveys. He wanted to coordinate our data collection efforts." This revelation explained the unauthorized trips that Redwing had been making to remote areas of McKenzie County. He hadn't been conducting random environmental surveys. He'd been working with tribal environmental officials to document systematic contamination that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. According to Crow Dog, Redwing had been particularly interested in areas where pipeline routes crossed traditional sacred sites. "He understood that our people have been observing this land for generations," she explained. "When we told him about places where the earth seemed different than it used to be, he took those observations seriously." The collaboration between Redwing and tribal environmental monitors had been kept secret because of the complex legal and political implications. Federal environmental inspectors are prohibited from conducting joint investigations with tribal authorities without approval from both EPA headquarters and the relevant tribal councils. Such approval can take months to obtain and requires extensive documentation. Redwing and Crow Dog had decided to collect data first and seek official authorization later. When investigators examined Redwing's home computer, they discovered encrypted files containing 2 years of environmental data that had never been reported through official EPA channels. The files included water quality measurements, soil contamination reports, and atmospheric monitoring data from dozens of locations throughout McKenzie County. The data revealed contamination levels that were significantly higher than what oil companies had reported in their mandatory environmental impact statements. More disturbing, the contamination appeared to be spreading in patterns that suggested pipeline leaks or underground storage failures on a massive scale. FBI computer forensics specialist agent Maria Santos analyzed the encryption on Redwing's files. This wasn't casual password protection, Santos reported. James Redwing was using military-grade encryption software to protect this data. He was clearly concerned that someone might try to access it without authorization. The files also contained email correspondence between Redwing and environmental scientists at universities across the country. The emails revealed that Redwing had been quietly building a case for federal intervention in McKenzie County's oil industry, documenting environmental violations that could result in billions of dollars in fines and cleanup costs. Dr. Margaret Holstrom, an environmental geologist at the University of North Dakota who had been corresponding with Redwing, told investigators that his data suggested systematic failures in pipeline integrity, monitoring throughout the Bakken Formation. James was documenting evidence that multiple oil companies were either unaware of significant pipeline leaks or were aware and not reporting them as required by federal law, Holstrom explained. His data showed methane emissions that were orders of magnitude higher than what companies were reporting to the EPA. Perhaps most significantly, Redwing's files contained internal oil company documents that should never have been accessible to a federal inspector. Email chains between company executives discussed environmental compliance issues and reputation management strategies related to unreported pipeline problems. One email, dated 3 weeks before Redwing's disappearance, was particularly damning. Sent from TransCanada Pipeline Services to Apex Energy Solutions, it read, "Federal inspector becoming problem. Recommend immediate implementation of containment protocols per previous discussions." The email was signed by David Chen, the same operations manager who had denied any contact with James Redwing. When confronted with this evidence, Chen's attorney issued a statement claiming that the email had been taken out of context and referred to standard environmental compliance procedures. TransCanada Pipeline Services issued a similar statement, denying any wrongdoing and expressing full cooperation with the investigation. But Sarah Crow Dog wasn't convinced by corporate denials. James knew he was in danger, she told investigators. The last time we spoke, he said he'd found evidence that the contamination problems were much worse than anyone realized, and that powerful people were working to cover it up. Crow Dog's final piece of information was the most chilling. According to tribal environmental monitors, the anomalous methane readings that had attracted Redwing's attention weren't limited to McKenzie County. Similar patterns had been detected at monitoring stations across North Dakota, Montana, and Saskatchewan. Anywhere that Bakken Formation pipelines crossed underground water systems. What James discovered wasn't just a local problem, Crow Dog explained. It was evidence of environmental damage on a scale that could affect millions of people across the northern Great Plains. The question that haunted investigators was whether James Redwing had simply stumbled onto evidence of corporate environmental crimes, or whether he had discovered something even more dangerous, something that powerful interests were willing to kill to keep secret. The gas readings from James Redwing's equipment troubled environmental scientist Dr. Elena Vasquez more than she initially let on. As the lead analyst for the EPA's Denver regional office, she had reviewed thousands of methane monitoring reports from oil field operations across the northern plains. But the data recovered from Redwing's portable detector defied everything she understood about natural gas behavior. The concentrations were impossible, Dr. Vasquez would later explain to federal investigators. We're talking about methane levels that would require massive underground chambers or catastrophic pipeline ruptures. But there were no pipeline breaks reported in that area. No equipment failures, nothing that would explain readings of 800 parts per million sustained over a 40-minute period. The readings became even more puzzling when mapped against topographical surveys. Redwing's detector had recorded the highest concentrations, not near active wells or pipeline routes, but in areas that geological surveys showed as having minimal subsurface disturbance. According to the data, the Earth itself seemed to be releasing methane in rhythmic pulses every 12 to 15 minutes. Local ranchers, when pressed by investigators, began sharing observations they had previously kept to themselves. Martha Erdrich, whose family had run cattle on the same land for 4 generations, described ground temperature variations she had never seen before. "There are patches of prairie where the snow melts different now," she told Deputy Mike Larson during a follow-up interview. "Strips may be 10 feet wide, running for half a mile or more. The grass dies back in summer, but not from drought. It's like something underneath is affecting it. These unusual vegetation patterns, when photographed from aerial surveys conducted by tribal environmental officer Sarah Crowdog, revealed an intricate network extending across multiple ranch properties. The affected zones followed no visible pipeline routes or geological features marked on county maps. Instead, they created what Crowdog described as a web of environmental stresses spreading beneath McKenzie County's wheat fields and grazing land. The geological explanation proved equally mysterious. Dr. Richard Tomahawk, a tribal geologist who had been quietly documenting environmental changes for the Manda Nation, requested soil samples from areas matching Redwing's gas readings. The results showed unusual mineral compositions and trace chemicals that suggested long-term exposure to petroleum compounds. But the chemical signatures didn't match known crude oil or natural gas compositions from the Bacon Formation. What we found was more complex, Dr. Tomahawk explained in his report to tribal leadership. The soil chemistry suggested multiple hydrocarbon sources, some consistent with deep formation deposits that shouldn't be accessible without extensive drilling. It was as if different underground reservoirs were somehow connected or had been artificially breached. Tribal elders, when consulted about the unusual ground conditions, shared knowledge that had been passed down through generations. Calvin Crowfeather, a traditional storyteller and former tribal council member, described locations his grandfather had called restless ground, places where the earth seemed unstable during certain seasons. Our people knew these places, Crowfeather told investigators during a recorded interview at the Tribal Administration Building. We knew not to camp there during certain times, not to let the horses graze where the ground was too warm. The old one said the earth spirits were restless in those places, that something deep down was trying to surface. Modern seismic monitoring, hastily installed by the North Dakota Geological Survey following Redwing's disappearance, detected subtle ground movement in the same areas where tribal tradition warned of unstable earth. The microtremors occurred in regular patterns, roughly every 12 to 15 minutes, the same interval as the methane pulse readings from Redwing's detector. Dr. Janet Holbrook, a geophysicist from the University of North Dakota, analyzed 3 months of seismic data and found correlations that challenged conventional understanding of Bacon Formation geology. The pressure variations we're seeing suggest connected subsurface chambers or fault systems that don't appear on any geological survey, she noted in her preliminary report. Either there are natural formations we've completely missed, or industrial activity has created connections between previously separate underground systems. The fracking operations that had transformed McKenzie County over the past decade involved injecting millions of gallons of water and chemicals deep into shale formations under extreme pressure. Industry representatives maintained that their operations followed strict geological protocols and couldn't possibly affect formations outside the targeted beacon layer. But environmental advocates argued that the cumulative impact of hundreds of wells across thousands of square miles might be creating unforeseen underground connections. As winter approached, ranchers reported new phenomena. Ground that should have frozen solid remained soft in irregular patches. Springs that had run clear for decades began producing water with petroleum odors. And in the quiet hours before dawn, some residents claimed that they could detect subtle sounds, a deep, rhythmic resonance that seemed to come from miles underground. James Redwing had been investigating these anomalies the night he disappeared. His unauthorized surveys had been documenting environmental changes that neither government agencies nor oil companies wanted to acknowledge. But his final gas readings suggested something far more dramatic than gradual contamination or regulatory violations. They suggested that the earth beneath McKenzie County was responding to industrial pressure in ways that no one fully understood. The question remained, had Redwing discovered evidence of environmental damage that threatened powerful corporate interests, or had he encountered natural phenomena that challenged the very foundations of geological science? In either case, his disappearance left behind only data points and disturbing questions about what lay beneath the changing landscape of North Dakota. Somewhere in McKenzie County's oil fields, the earth continued to release methane in patterns that defied explanation, while the federal inspector who had been documenting these changes remained missing, his fate as mysterious as the geological anomalies he had died trying to understand. 3 days after Dr. Vasquez's preliminary analysis of Redwing's gas readings was submitted to federal investigators, Apex Energy Solutions deployed what they called a crisis management team to McKenzie County. The team arrived not in corporate vehicles, but in unmarked black SUVs that local residents noticed parked outside the county courthouse, the sheriff's office, and several ranches where investigators had been conducting interviews. The team leader, introduced only as Mr. Marcus Paulson, held meetings with county commissioners and oil industry representatives that were not open to the public. According to meeting minutes later, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, the discussions focused on protecting proprietary technology and managing misinformation about standard industrial operations. Apex claimed that Redwing's environmental readings contained commercially sensitive data about their extraction processes that could not be shared with outside parties without violating trade secret protections. Federal Environmental Protection Agency investigator Sarah Mitchell found herself facing unexpected obstacles when she attempted to expand the investigation into Redwing's disappearance. Suddenly, every document request was being reviewed by teams of lawyers, Mitchell later testified to a congressional oversight committee. Sites that had been accessible to federal inspectors for years were declared off-limits due to ongoing proprietary research. It was unlike anything I had experienced in 15 years of environmental law enforcement. The legal challenges multiplied rapidly. Apex Energy retained Morrison, Clark and Associates, a Washington, D.C. firm specializing in energy industry crisis management. Within a week, federal investigators received cease and desist letters claiming that their investigation was interfering with ongoing intellectual property litigation between Apex and its technology contractors. The letters demanded that all environmental data collected from Apex-operated sites be sealed pending resolution of the proprietary technology disputes. Private security contractors began appearing at oil field installations throughout McKenzie County. These weren't typical industrial security guards, but former military personnel employed by Blackwater Solutions, a subsidiary of the same crisis management firm. Local ranchers reported being questioned about their interactions with federal investigators, with the security personnel identifying themselves only as industrial safety consultants. Martha Erdrich, the fourth-generation rancher, who had described unusual ground temperature patterns to investigators, received an unexpected visit from two men in business suits who claimed to represent a land-use consulting firm. They offered to purchase her mineral rights at prices significantly above market value, but the contract included non-disclosure clauses that would prevent her from discussing environmental conditions on her property with any government agencies or media outlets. They said it was routine, Erdrich later told Deputy Mike Larson. But when I asked which company they worked for, they just smiled and said it was better if I didn't know. That's when I decided I didn't want their money. Other witnesses began changing their stories or becoming unavailable for follow-up interviews. Dr. Richard Tomahawk, the tribal geologist who had analyzed soil samples showing unusual chemical signatures, was placed on administrative leave by his university employer pending an academic misconduct investigation. The investigation concerned allegations that he had violated research protocols by conducting unauthorized geological surveys on private land. Sheriff Tom Backen found his department's resources stretched thin as legal challenges mounted. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every scientific report was being challenged in court, Backen explained to county commissioners during a budget meeting. We were spending more time dealing with lawyers than investigating the actual disappearance. It felt deliberate. The most disturbing development came through an anonymous leak to the Minot Daily News. A source claiming to be an Apex Energy employee provided internal company emails discussing what executives called asset protection and reputation management in connection with James Redwing's investigation activities. One email, dated 2 weeks before Redwing's disappearance, read, "Redwing's situation requires immediate containment. Recommend full-spectrum response, including legal, regulatory, and field-level interventions. Cannot allow unauthorized environmental assessment to impact Q4 extraction target." When pressed about the leaked emails, Apex Energy's corporate communications director, Janet Morrison, denied their authenticity and accused environmental activists of fabricating evidence to damage the company's reputation. These alleged documents are clearly falsified attempts to create controversy where none exists, Morrison stated during a press conference in Bismarck. Apex Energy has fully cooperated with all legitimate law enforcement inquiries regarding Mr. Redwing's unfortunate disappearance. However, federal investigators noted that Apex's definition of cooperation seemed carefully limited. The company provided access to personnel records and official inspection schedules, but claimed that security footage from the night of Redwing's disappearance had been automatically overwritten due to standard data retention policies. Equipment logs that might have shown which facilities Redwing had actually visited were declared proprietary information subject to ongoing patent litigation. Tribal Environmental Officer Sarah Crow Dog faced her own pressure campaign. The Bureau of Indian Affairs received formal complaints about her unauthorized coordination with federal agencies and demands that her environmental monitoring activities be reviewed for compliance with tribal authority limitations. Anonymous callers to the Tribal Administration Office claimed that Crow Dog was being paid by environmental extremist groups to fabricate evidence of contamination. They wanted to isolate everyone who had been working with James. Crow Dog later explained to tribal council members, if they could discredit each of us individually, they could control the entire narrative about what happened to him. By March 2024, 6 months after Redwing's disappearance, the corporate response had effectively stalled the federal investigation. Key witnesses were unavailable, crucial evidence was tied up in litigation, and the few government agencies still pursuing the case found themselves fighting legal battles rather than conducting fieldwork. What had begun as a missing person investigation had evolved into a complex web of corporate liability, intellectual property disputes, and jurisdictional challenges that seemed designed more to exhaust investigators than to find James Redwing. The question that haunted federal investigator Sarah Mitchell was whether this level of corporate resistance indicated guilty knowledge of what had happened to Redwing or simply standard industry practice when facing potential environmental liability. Either way, the result was the same. Someone had made James Redwing's investigation disappear almost as completely as they had made James Redwing himself vanish into the night. On March 15, 2024, exactly 6 months after James Redwing's disappearance, the FBI officially suspended its investigation into the case. Special Agent Patricia Hendricks cited insufficient evidence to warrant continued federal resources and lack of cooperation from key witnesses as primary factors in the decision. The case file, nearly 800 pages of interviews, environmental data, and corporate correspondence, was transferred to the McKenzie County Sheriff's Office for storage. Sheriff Tom Bakken accepted the transfer with resignation rather than satisfaction. "We all knew James," Bakken told the Minot Daily News. "He wasn't the kind of man who just vanished. Something happened to him out there, but 6 months later, we're no closer to knowing what. Sometimes the system fails, and this is one of those times." The federal government's withdrawal from the case didn't end the mysterious events plaguing McKenzie County out. If anything, they intensified. New environmental inspectors assigned to Redwing's former routes reported equipment malfunctions with disturbing frequency. GPS devices lost satellite contact in specific areas. Gas detectors provided inconsistent readings. Vehicle engines experienced unexplained problems on remote service roads. Dr. Marcus Webb, a pipeline safety specialist who took over part of Redwing's inspection territory, documented 17 separate equipment failures during his first 3 months on the job. "It was like the area itself was resistant to monitoring," Webb noted in his supervisor reports. Electronic equipment that worked perfectly everywhere else would malfunction within a 5-mile radius of certain coordinates. "I started carrying backup devices, then backups." The Mandan Tribal Environmental Monitoring Program, led by Sarah Crow Dog, continued independently of federal oversight. Using private funding and volunteer support, the tribal program expanded its groundwater testing and soil analysis throughout the traditional territory that now fell within McKenzie County. Their findings painted a picture of accelerating environmental degradation that federal agencies were no longer investigating. The contamination patterns were spreading, Crow Dog explained during a tribal council meeting in spring 2024. What James had been tracking wasn't a static problem. It was getting worse, following underground pathways that connected distant well sites and pipeline routes. The Earth was still exhibiting unusual behavior, but now it was affecting larger areas. Tribal monitoring detected petroleum compounds in water sources 30 miles from the nearest active drilling operations. Soil samples revealed chemical signatures suggesting that underground formations were somehow mixing fluids from different geological layers. Most disturbing, the rhythmic ground movements that seismic monitors had detected were increasing in frequency and intensity. Ranchers throughout the county reported new phenomena that seemed to follow seasonal patterns. Ground that remained unfrozen during winter now stayed warm through spring and summer. Native plants died in expanding geometric patterns that aerial photography revealed as vast underground networks. Livestock avoided certain areas instinctively, clustering in shrinking zones of unaffected grazing land. Martha Erdrich documented these changes with photographs and detailed journals that she shared with anyone willing to listen. "The land is trying to tell us something," she insisted during a county commission meeting. James understood that. Maybe that's why he's gone, because he was listening when others chose not to hear. In September 2024, James Redwing's family received the first of several anonymous packages. The return address was simply a friend, and the contents included personal items that had not been found during the initial search. His backup GPS unit, his personal notebook containing hand-drawn maps of contamination sites, and a USB drive containing environmental data spanning 3 years. The GPS unit's memory revealed that Redwing had been conducting unauthorized surveys for far longer than investigators had realized. The waypoints showed a systematic pattern of visits to locations throughout western North Dakota, many on private land and tribal territory, where he had no official inspection authority. The data suggested that Redwing had been building a comprehensive map of environmental damage that crossed jurisdictional boundaries and corporate property lines. His notebook contained detailed observations written in a careful hand. Ground temperature 15 degrees above ambient at Site 47. Methane seepage, following buried pipeline route, not shown on county maps. Vegetation death pattern suggests subsurface contamination extending 200 yards from wellhead. Local rancher reports cattle illness, same symptoms as Sites 23 and 31. The USB drive contained the most disturbing evidence: chemical analysis reports, groundwater test results, and soil contamination data that painted a picture of systematic environmental destruction across thousands of square miles. The files were organized by date, location, and contamination type, suggesting years of methodical documentation. Many of the test results came from private laboratories rather than government facilities, indicating that Redwing had been paying for analysis out of his own pocket. Most significant was a file labeled Network Analysis that contained maps showing how underground contamination was spreading along geological fault lines and aquifer systems that connected oil field operations across multiple counties. The analysis suggested that the Bakken Formation had been compromised on a scale that government agencies and oil companies had never acknowledged publicly. Subsequent anonymous packages arrived every few months, each containing additional evidence of Redwing's investigation. Corporate emails discussing environmental exposure mitigation. Geological survey reports that contradicted public safety assessments. Internal company documents acknowledging contamination levels that exceeded federal safety standards. The source of these packages remained unknown. Someone with access to corporate records, government files, and Redwing's personal research was systematically releasing information that built a case for environmental disaster and corporate cover-up. But who and why now? As of December 2024, James Redwing remains missing. The environmental conditions he was investigating continue to worsen, documented now by tribal monitors and independent researchers, rather than federal agencies. Equipment malfunctions still plagued the remote areas where Redwing conducted his final survey. And somewhere beneath the prairie of McKenzie County, the Earth continues to exhibit the unusual behavior that first drew a federal inspector's attention on a cold October night. The mystery of James Redwing's disappearance may never be solved, but his work continues, carried forward by others who believe that the Earth's changing behavior holds answers that powerful interests prefer to keep buried beneath the breathing ground of North Dakota.
If this case stays with you, you're not alone. Here at Unresolved America, we cover cases like this every single day. Stories that deserve to be remembered, questions that refuse to fade. If you want to keep these investigations alive, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. Drop a like if this story moved you, and leave a comment telling us which detail haunts you most. Until tomorrow, stay curious, stay vigilant, and never stop asking questions.